rain came down the window in threads that never quite ran straight, and she watched them instead of watching the man across the desk, because it was easier. The check sat in her palm, damp already from her own skin, the ink of the number so ordinary it seemed almost cruel. $4,000 and nothing else, for 9 years of her life. Beneath it, a scrap of paper in a dead man's handwriting told her to buy something that grows. She would, but not before the room finished laughing at her, and not before this story finished proving them wrong. The lawyer's office smelled of wet wool and old paper, the particular mustiness of a building that had processed 100 years of other families' griefs before this one. Outside, Santa Rosa was gray and streaked, October doing what October does in Sonoma County, turning the light thin and silver, stripping the last color from the hills. Inside, the radiator ticked. A clock on the shelf, the kind with a brass pendulum, kept time nobody in that room wanted to feel passing. She had dressed carefully that morning, though she couldn't have said why. A gray coat, a little too big, bought for a funeral 3 years earlier and never worn since. Her hands, she noticed, still carried the faint stain of the vineyard under the nails, a half-moon of soil that no amount of scrubbing had gotten out in 9 years, and that no lawyer's office was going to shame away in one morning. She had come from the earth. She would go back to it. She simply did not know yet how far. The two people seated to her left did not carry soil under their nails. They carried watches that cost more than her truck, and coats that had never been rained on standing still. They had flown and driven in from other lives to hear what was theirs, and they already knew, in the comfortable way of people who have always been given things, that it would be considerable. It was 40 acres, a house with a wraparound porch her grandfather built with his own hands the same year Kennedy was shot, a name on a deed that had outlived him. And for her, 9 years of frost watches and broken irrigation lines, of holding his hand through the last winter when the coughing kept them both awake till dawn, $4,000 and 11 words in handwriting that trembled toward the end, as if he'd known exactly how this morning would go, and had tried, in his failing hand, to leave her something the others couldn't take. She did not cry. That would come later, in the truck, in the rain, where no one could enjoy it. What she did was fold the note along its worn crease, put it in her coat pocket next to her heart like something alive, and listen, really listen, for the first time that morning, to the exact words her family chose to use next. 9 years is a long time to learn the exact words a family will choose, but she had started learning them long before that October morning, in a season she rarely let herself remember, because remembering it whole would have undone her in front of people who did not deserve to see it. She had been 17, and it had been late August, the valley heat still holding its breath at 9 at night, when her grandfather's truck pulled up the gravel drive with her single suitcase rattling in the bed. Her mother had been dead 11 days. She did not remember the funeral so much as the smell of it, lilies gone slightly brown at the edges, and beneath that, faint and stubborn, the diesel and crushed grapeskin smell that clung to the old man's clothes no matter how many times he washed them. He had not said much. He was not a man who said much. He had carried her suitcase up the porch steps himself, though by then his knees had already begun their slow argument with him, and he had shown her the room at the end of the hall that had been her mother's once, decades before either of them had learned to be sad about anything. The Vineyard in those days was not the postcard it would become for visitors who arrived twice a year with wine glasses already halfway to their mouths. It was work. It was her grandfather waking her before 5 with a lantern because the power to the lower rows had gone out again, walking her between the trellises while the fog still sat low and silver over the cordons, teaching her to read a vine the way other men read weather, the curl of a leaf, the give of the soil under a boot heel, the particular green that meant thirst versus the particular green that meant rot. He talked more out there than anywhere else, as if the dark and the rose gave him permission. He told her which blocks his own father had planted, which ones he'd grafted himself in 1962, with a knife he still kept in a drawer she was forbidden to touch, which vines had survived a freeze in 72, that had killed half the county's crop. He never once mentioned her mother by name during those lantern hours. He didn't have to. Everything he taught her about staying, about a plant that would rather die in place than be moved, was, she understood even then, a kind of eulogy. By 19, she could smell rain 2 hours before it fell. By 22, she was the one waking him, and somewhere in those years, without either of them naming it, the vineyard had stopped being his and started being theirs. In every sense but the one, she would learn on a rainy October morning years later that a lawyer's office actually recognized. The rhythm of those 9 years had a shape she could have drawn blind. February meant pruning, her fingers gone numb inside wool gloves by 9 in the morning, the shears clicking through cane after cane until her shoulder ached in a way that felt almost like ownership. March brought the frost watches, the two of them out at 3 in the morning with the wind machines groaning to life, checking thermometers nailed to fence posts, boiling coffee on a propane burner, because the cold at that hour had a way of getting into the bone that no jacket solved. She learned to read the sky the way other girls her age read magazines. A clear night in April was a threat. A cloud ceiling was mercy. Summer meant irrigation lines and canopy management. Long days bent low between rows pulling suckers. Her back sunburned through her shirt by July, no matter how many times she reapplied the sunscreen he teased her for forgetting. And then harvest, 6-7 weeks each fall where sleep became a rumor, where they picked by headlamp before the sugars spiked in the afternoon heat, where the crusher ran until midnight and the whole property smelled of must and diesel and the particular sweetness of fruit going soft in the bins. Her half-siblings arrived twice a year, punctual as the equinox, Thanksgiving and, some years, a long weekend in June that they called checking in on Dad. They came in clean shoes that never once touched the crush pad. There were photographs, her half-sister arranging herself against a barrel with a glass of the estate's own Cabernet, captioning it, "Roots run deep." For an audience of strangers, her half-brother posing beside the old farm truck he'd never once driven, laughing at how rustic it all was, how authentic. They stayed at the house, not the cottage. They left before the dishes were done. "You must love it out here," her half-sister said once, watching Margot come in from a frost watch at 4 in the morning, dirt under her nails, eyes red from the smoke of the wind machines. It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence people said to excuse themselves from ever asking what love like that actually cost. Her half-brother, for his part, mostly talked about the land's appraised value, the acreage comps 2 towns over, the tasting room he thought the estate should build, if anyone around here had a business mind. He said this standing in a doorway Margot had repainted herself the spring before, in a kitchen where she had learned to cook for a man who could no longer stand at a stove. None of it wounded her the way it might have once. She had stopped expecting them to see it. The 2 in the morning cold, the smell of diesel and crushed fruit, the particular ache of a body that had given itself entirely to a piece of land. She told herself their absence was simply the shape their love took. She believed this, mostly, until the October morning a lawyer read a will in a room with rain sliding down the windows, and she learned exactly how little of what she'd built had ever, on paper, belonged to her at all. The decline had come slowly, the way frost comes to a valley. Not all at once, but in a gradual tightening that no single morning could be blamed for. It began 2 years before the end, with a cough that arrived in the fog season and never fully left, a wet rattling sound that she learned to hear through 2 closed doors. By the second winter he could no longer walk the rows without stopping every 20 paces, one hand pressed flat against a post, his breath fogging out in front of him like something trying to leave his body ahead of schedule. She started walking beside him then, not because he asked, but because she had learned that asking was a thing he had stopped doing decades ago, about anything. She adjusted her life around the sound of him. She learned to sleep with one ear tuned to the floorboards outside his room, learned the difference between the cough that meant nothing and the one that meant she should already be up, already moving toward the kettle and the folded towel and the low lamp he liked lit when his chest hurt. She learned to cut his food into pieces small enough that pride wouldn't have to watch itself fail. There was a particular smell to those months: mentholated rub, wet wool, the diesel breath of the tractor she still had to run alone before dawn, and it settled into her the way vineyard smoke settles into a coat, permanent, part of her now whether she wanted it or not. Her half-siblings visited on schedules that never seemed to bend for worse or better. Thanksgiving, a long weekend in March. They arrived with wine from other valleys and left before the dishes were done. They sat with him in the front room and grew visibly uneasy when his silences stretched, when he simply looked out at the vines instead of answering, and they filled that silence with talk of San Francisco deal flow, of a boutique client roster, of anything that moved forward instead of settling backward into whatever he was thinking. "He's just tired," her half-sister would say afterward, in the driveway, keys already in hand. "He's always tired now," her half-brother added once, checking his watch, as though fatigue were a personal failing Walton had recently developed. They did not see what she saw, how his hands, once thick and sure around a pruning knife, had gone thin and spotted and slow, how some mornings he mistook her for her grandmother, dead 11 years, and called her by that name so gently that she never corrected him. She only answered. She held his hand through the worst of the coughing fits, counted his breaths in the dark, learned to love a man in the specific, unglamorous currency of hours nobody else was willing to spend. None of that, she would learn, counted for anything a lawyer could write down. Walton Ellery died on the 3rd of October, 4 days after the last of the fog had failed to lift by noon, which the old hands on the property took as a kind of omen, though no one said so aloud. He went in the early hours, in the same bed he had shared with his wife for 41 years, and Margot was the one who found him, not weeping, not yet, but standing very still in the doorway with the light still off, counting the seconds, until she understood that she was no longer counting his breaths for a reason. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small family cemetery at the edge of the Vineyard's north block, where 4 generations of Elleris lay under modest granite among rows of Cabernet vines, just past their autumn color. The sky did not storm, it simply wept, a thin and patient drizzle that beaded on wool coats and darkened the shoulders of anyone who stood outside longer than 10 minutes. Her half-brother arrived in a charcoal overcoat that belonged in a boardroom, his shoes, Italian leather, unscuffed, sinking half an inch into the softened earth with each step, and he spent the service glancing down at them with a faint, private irritation, as though the ground itself had committed a discourtesy. Her half-sister wore heels that would not survive the walk back to the cars, and had to be steadied twice by a cousin she barely acknowledged otherwise. They stood at the graveside dressed for a boardroom in San Francisco or a gallery opening in Los Angeles, umbrellas held at careful distances so as not to touch shoulders, murmuring to each other in the low, efficient tones of people managing a schedule rather than grieving a man. Margot stood without an umbrella. She had forgotten it, or perhaps had not wanted one. She could not afterwards say which. The rain moved through her hair and down the collar of the one black dress she owned, and she did not move to fix it, because moving felt like the first act of a life that no longer had him in it, and she was not ready to begin that life yet. The priest spoke of a man who had built something from raw ground with his own hands, who had turned 40 scraped acres into a legacy, and her half-siblings nodded along at the appropriate intervals, the way one nods through a toast at a dinner one is eager to leave. When it came time to lower the casket, her half-brother checked his watch, not covertly, not cruelly, just automatically, the way a man checks the time when a meeting has run long, and Margot watched him do it, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. Afterward, in the gravel lot beside the tasting room, her half-sister touched her arm and said, "We'll sort everything out properly this week. Daddy would have wanted it clean," and Margot only nodded, because she did not yet know how wrong that promise was, or how soon she would learn it, dressed in the same damp black dress, in a lawyer's office 3 days later. The law office occupied the second floor of a brick building on 4th Street, above a shuttered bakery, and the rain that October morning came down in the thin, patient way that Sonoma rain sometimes did, less a storm than a mood the sky had settled into. She parked on the street because the small lot behind the building was already full. Her half-brother's black Audi and her half-sister's rented sedan both angled in at careless speeds, as though the drivers had been in a hurry to arrive somewhere they already considered theirs. Inside, the windows ran with water in long, unbroken sheets, blurring the maples across the street into smears of rust and gold, and the room smelled of dust and printer toner and the particular staleness of a space where old men had made important decisions for 40 years. The attorney was already seated when she came in, a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up into thinning gray hair, a manila folder squared precisely in front of him, like a man arranging his own composure before a difficult task. Her half-brother sat with one ankle crossed over his knee, checking his phone. Her half-sister had brought a leather portfolio, unopened, the kind of prop that suggested competence rather than requiring it. Neither of them looked at her when she sat down in the chair nearest the door, still in the same black dress, still smelling faintly of the wet gravel from the cemetery 3 days before. "Shall we begin?" the attorney said, not quite a question, and unfolded the will with the slow care of a man who had read too many of these documents to feel anything about them anymore, and yet felt something about this one. He read through the preliminary language first, the boilerplate about soundness of mind, the revocation of prior wills, the standard cadence of legal English that turned a man's whole life into a string of whereas and hereinafter. And her half-siblings sat through it with the loose, settled posture of people listening to the terms of a gift already unwrapped in their minds. Her half-brother had, in fact, mentioned to a colleague the week before that he was finally going to deal with the Vineyard properly, and her half-sister had already spoken, once, to a branding consultant in Los Angeles about a tasting room redesign. Rain ticked against the glass. Somewhere below, a delivery truck idled and pulled away. "To my grandchildren," the attorney read, and here he paused, barely, almost nothing, the kind of pause a careful man allows himself before a sentence he knows will land unevenly in a room. "I leave the Ellery Vineyard, comprising the 40-acre parcel and all structures thereon, jointly, in equal shares." Her half-brother exhaled, a small, satisfied sound. Her half-sister's mouth did something close to a smile. The attorney turned a page. "To my granddaughter," he continued, and now his eyes lifted, briefly, to find her across the table. "I leave the sum of $4,000, and this." He slid a small, yellowed envelope across the desk, and the room, for a moment, went very still. Margot did not reach for the envelope right away. She sat with her hands flat on the table, the way she had learned to hold them still when a horse was spooked or a graft needed a steady grip, and she looked at the thing as if it might require the same patience. The paper had gone the color of weak tea at its edges, and someone, her grandfather surely, though she could not yet make herself believe it, had folded it in thirds a long time ago, so that the creases had softened into the fiber itself. "Is that it?" her half-brother said. It was not a question. He said it the way a man says a number that has already disappointed him, checking it against a figure he'd expected. $4,000. The attorney did not look up. "The check is drawn on the estate's operating account and is valid for 90 days, he said, in the same flat register he had used for the acreage and the structures thereon, as though there were no difference in weight between a vineyard and a number that would not cover 4 months of rent. Her half-sister leaned forward slightly, and Margot could see her doing the arithmetic of the room, the house, the 40 acres, the tasting room she had already redesigned in her head, settling comfortably into her own good fortune before she spoke. "Well," she said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if she had been unkind on purpose. He always did know how to make a point. "It's not a point," Margot said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though she felt something in her chest folding the way the envelope had folded, into smaller and smaller thirds. "No," her half-brother agreed, already reaching for his phone, already elsewhere. "It's $4,000 and a note. I'd call that pretty clear." The attorney's pen had stopped moving. He was watching her now with the particular stillness of a man who has read 100 wills and recognizes, this time, that the paper in front of him does not match the room it has been read into. He did not say so. He only slid a second, smaller item toward her, a keychain with a single brass key, unlabeled, and said, "There is also this, though the will does not specify its use. Your grandfather asked that it be included with your bequest." Nobody else seemed to notice it. Her half-sister was already murmuring something about contractors, her half-brother something about a call he needed to make before noon. Rain kept ticking against the glass, patient and indifferent, the way rain is in October in that part of the county, and Margot closed her hand around the key and the envelope both, feeling the brass warm faster than the paper, and did not open either one. Not yet, not there, not in front of them. The silence did not last. It never did in that family. Silence was simply the pause before someone decided it was theirs to fill. Her half-sister turned first, tilting her head with the practiced sympathy she used on clients whose branding was failing. "I mean, it's actually kind of poetic, if you think about it," she said, folding her copy of the will into her handbag like a receipt she'd already decided to dispute. 9 years of dirt under your nails, and Grandpa gives you dirt, a little more dirt, somewhere else. She smiled as though she'd landed a joke rather than a blow, and perhaps, in her mind, she had. Her half-brother did not even look up from his phone. "It's not poetic, it's practical," he said, thumbs moving. "She was always going to end up with land nobody wants. At least now it's official." He glanced at her then, briefly, the way one glances at a gas gauge, enough to register the number, not enough to care what it meant. "Buy something that grows." That's basically the only sentence anyone's ever going to need to describe you at the funeral home guest book. 9 years, and that's the eulogy. Growing things. That's the whole resume. The attorney's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a small muscle doing what his mouth would not. He said nothing. He had learned, in 30 years of rooms like this one, that intervening only extended the cruelty. The quickest mercy was silence, and letting it burn itself out. Her half-sister was not finished. "You could have gone to school," she said, not unkindly exactly, which was somehow worse, delivered in the tone of a woman offering advice rather than an insult, as if she believed herself generous. "You could have done literally anything else with your 20s, and instead, you stayed up there weeding rows for a man who apparently thought $4,000 covered it." She shrugged, a small, elegant motion, rehearsed for boardrooms. "I guess dirt's honest work. Someone has to want to smell like a tractor." "Grow something," her half-brother repeated, almost to himself, turning the phrase over like a coin he found funny to spend. It's honestly the least cruel thing he could have written. At least it's on brand. She did not answer either of them. She had spent 9 years learning that a vine does not respond to insult, only to attention, and there was a strange, cold comfort in treating the room the same way, as weather to be endured, not argued with. She kept her hand closed around the key and the envelope, feeling the warmth leave the brass now, replaced by the chill of the office's recycled air, and watched the rain instead, tracking one slow bead down the glass until it lost itself among the others. Behind her, the small talk resumed. Contractors, calls, someone's flight time, as though the room had already forgotten she was in it. She stood, finally, and gathered nothing else, because there was nothing else to gather. The hallway outside the conference room smelled of wet umbrellas and toner, an ordinary smell for what had just happened to her, and she found that detail obscene in its way, that the machinery of the world kept humming while something in her chest had gone quiet and strange. She buttoned her coat with fingers that did not quite belong to her. The check was still folded into a small, tight square, the kind of fold a person makes when they intend never to unfold it and look at it again, and she pushed it into the inside pocket against her ribs, where she could feel its edges through the wool. She did not look back toward the room. She had learned, in 9 years of pruning canes in February cold, that looking back at a cut only made the hand shake on the next one. The lawyer caught her at the elevator. He moved the way older men in expensive offices sometimes move when they are embarrassed by their own profession, quickly, apologetically, as though speed might excuse what he was about to say. He held a slim manila folder against his chest, the kind used for things that had not yet earned a proper binder, and for a moment he simply stood there in the fluorescent light while the elevator light did not change. "There's something I filed separately," he said, "not part of the reading. I didn't think today was the day for it." She waited. Rain ticked against the window at the end of the hall, patient, indifferent. "It's nothing that changes anything," he added, too quickly, the way people speak when they suspect the opposite is true. "Some old correspondence, land records mostly. Your grandfather asked me to hold it until—" He stopped, recalibrated, chose the safer sentence. "Until I judged it useful." "And is it," she asked, "useful?" "I don't know yet." He said it plainly, without the practiced smoothness he'd used all morning, reading clauses aloud to a room full of people who wanted numbers. "I haven't finished going through it myself. There's a lot of it, and some of it's older than either of us." He did not open the folder. He did not offer it to her. He simply held it, as though weighing some private calculation about timing, propriety, the strange etiquette of dead men's secrets, and then he said only, "I'll call you when I know what I have." The elevator arrived with a small mechanical sigh. She stepped in. He did not follow, and the doors closed on his face, still faintly troubled, the folder still pressed flat against his chest, like something he was protecting from the weather rather than delivering into it. Outside, the rain had thickened into the kind that soaked through wool in under a minute. She stood on the courthouse steps of the little Santa Rosa street and let it happen, because there was nowhere left in that town that belonged to her, and because the check in her pocket felt, for the first time, less like an insult than like the beginning of an instruction she did not yet know how to read. She did not go home to the apartment above the tasting room, because it no longer belonged to her in any sense that mattered, and because the boxes she had packed there sat now in the back of her truck like a small, humiliated confession. Instead, she drove north and west for 3 weeks, evenings mostly, after the temp job she had taken at a bottling plant in Windsor, scrolling listings on a phone with a cracked corner, looking for land the way another woman might look for a husband, with a list of disqualifying flaws and a stubborn, unexamined hope that the next one would be different. Most of it was wrong. A 5-acre parcel outside Cloverdale with soil so thin the seller's photos showed exposed shale like a bad scar. A pear orchard near Ukiah, handsome from the road, riddled with fire blight when she walked it in the rain, the trees weeping black at every wound. She learned to read listing photos the way her grandfather had taught her to read a vine, for what was missing from the frame, not what was in it. The apple orchard came up on a county auction site in the last week of October, filed under estate liquidation, 12 acres, in a fold of hills 2 counties over in Mendocino, the kind of address that required her to print a paper map because her phone lost signal a mile before the gate. The listing photo was 6 years old and showed rose in bloom. What she found, when she finally stood at the fence line with her collar up against a mist that wasn't quite rain, was something closer to a graveyard. Trees gone gray and lichened, canopies thin to fists of dead wood, a farmhouse at the far end with its porch roof caved in on one side like a face after a stroke. The owner had been a widow named Iris Calloway, dead 6 years, the estate unsettled that whole time by a nephew in Sacramento who wanted nothing from it but the check. The listing agent, a heavy-set man with a golf shirt wrong for the weather, walked the rows beside her, reciting acreage and zoning with the flat cadence of someone who had given up expecting a sale. "Nobody wants apples anymore," he said, not unkindly. "Everybody wants vines." She did not answer him. She was looking at the irrigation ditch that ran along the western boundary, half collapsed, choked with blackberry and the skeletal remains of some old wooden gate structure, and at the trees nearest it, which, though ruined above ground, showed at their base the thick, undefeated burl of root systems that had simply refused, for 6 untended years, to finish dying. She crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil beneath one trunk. It was cold, and it smelled of iron and old rain, and it held together in her palm the way good soil does, the way her grandfather's soil had, and something in her chest loosened for the first time since the lawyer's office. She wrote a number on the back of the county map and drove to the bank the next morning with a check for $4,000, folded soft as cloth in her coat pocket. The bank in the county seat smelled of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee, and the teller counted out nothing, because there was nothing to count. The transaction was a wire, a signature, a check that left her account and did not come back. $4,000, the entirety of what remained to her name after 9 years of labor that had produced, in the end, a note about growing things and a number too small to matter to anyone but her. She signed where the notary indicated. Her hand did not shake. She had expected it to. The agent had the paperwork drawn up within the week, as though relieved to finally close a file that had sat open for 6 years, gathering the particular dust of land nobody wanted. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought while sliding the deed across the table, that the previous owner, the widow, had died in a nursing home in Ukiah with no children to inherit, and that the county had nearly taken the parcel for unpaid taxes before a cousin twice removed had settled the debt just to sell it off. "Bad luck land," he said, and laughed once, briefly, at his own joke. Margot did not laugh. She thought of her grandfather's note, folded now soft as cloth from handling, and wondered whether bad luck land was precisely the kind he'd meant. There was no cushion left after the purchase, no savings account to catch her, no family telephone number she could call and expect warmth on the other end. Her half-brother had not answered her last 3 texts. Her half-sister had sent one message, days after the reading. "Hope the apples work out," with a punctuation mark that felt more like a period placed over a grave than any kind of blessing. Margot understood, standing alone in the orchard's gravel drive with the keys warm in her fist, that she had just spent the entirety of her inheritance, publicly mocked as it was, on 12 acres of collapsed irrigation ditch and trees more dead than alive. There was no undoing it. The check had cleared. The deed bore her name and no one else's. She drove back that evening past the Vineyard, though she told herself she wasn't going to, and slowed at the gate long enough to see lights on in the main house, her house, once, in every sense but paper, and a catering van parked crooked in the drive, as if her siblings had already begun celebrating a harvest they had not planted, pruned, or lost sleep over. She did not stop. She drove the 2 counties back to her ruined orchard in the dark, parked beside trees she could not yet see clearly, and sat for a long while with the engine off, listening to the tick of it cooling, feeling for the first time in weeks something that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but adjacent to both, the particular, unglamorous silence of a woman who has just bet everything she has on cracked earth and cannot, now, take it back. Morning showed her what darkness had spared her the night before, and it was worse than she had let herself imagine. The orchard sat on a gentle slope facing east, 12 acres that some long-dead surveyor had once considered promising ground, and every one of those acres now bore the particular ruin of 6 years' neglect. Rows of apple trees, Gravenstein mostly, with a few Arkansas blacks scattered near the fence line, stood in crooked lines like a congregation that had stopped believing. Blight had taken the bark in black weeping patches. Whole limbs hung dead and gray, brittle enough to snap under a bird's weight. Suckers grew wild from the rootstock where no one had cut them back, thin green whips reaching for light the canopy no longer gave. The fencing had collapsed in 3 places, wire rusted to the color of dried blood, posts leaning at angles that suggested deer had long since stopped bothering to jump and simply walked through. Somewhere past the second row she found a section flattened entirely, grass grown up through the wire mesh as if the land itself had decided to erase the boundary. The farmhouse was smaller than she remembered from the listing photos, and worse. The porch had caved on the north side, the boards gone soft and gray, sinking toward a foundation that had shifted in the last wet winter. A window on the second floor had been boarded from the inside, though by whom or for what reason she couldn't guess. The widow who'd owned this place had died alone, she'd been told, and something about the house held that fact in its silence. Not haunted exactly, but abandoned in the specific way that only happens when the person who loved a place stops being able to care for it before she stops living in it. She parked the truck at what she guessed had once been a turnaround and sat for a moment looking at all of it, the dead trees, the buckled fence, the sagging porch, through a windshield still speckled with yesterday's rain. Then she got out and started unloading tools. There was no crew coming, no foreman, no seasonal hires, no half-siblings arriving twice a year with wine and sympathy, and nothing that resembled work. There was a truck bed full of pruning saws and loppers and a chainsaw she'd bought used from a man in Ukiah who'd thrown in a spare chain for free when she told him what she was clearing. There was a bag of clothes she hadn't fully unpacked. There was a mattress she would carry into the house herself, because there was no one else to help her carry it. She stood in the first row before noon, loppers in hand, and made her first cut into a dead limb, the wood so dry it barely resisted, snapping clean with a sound like a bone breaking somewhere far off. Sawdust drifted down onto her boots. Somewhere behind the house, a hawk called once and went quiet. She did not stop to grieve the vineyard. There wasn't